Hello, History 72A. We are finally moving from initial encounters into full colonization mode at this point. With this lecture, we start a new module, constructions, particularly English constructions of land ownership and of labor have, as I noted briefly in the last lecture, had an outsized influence on the hegemonic forms of government and culture of the expanding United States, an influence that still holds for us in the 21st century. From this point through the end of the quarter, both land and labor in the early modern British mindset were rigidly sorted by gender and class, and quickly by race as well. We will be examining how this hierarchy, initially combining gender and class, shaped British colonization, or really, I should say at this point, English colonization, along the eastern seaboard of North America, and how that colonization shaped the directions that forms of labor took in the early United States. We will start out with the Chesapeake region here. For now, think Virginia, if that's more familiar, and then move on to New England. And if it's more familiar, just think Massachusetts, even though, again, it's a larger area. I've given this first lecture in Module C the title, The English Quest for Independence, Primogeniture, Enclosure, and the Chesapeake Colonies. The word independence will show up frequently in American history from here to the end of 72A. But this is one of those word concept packages that we need to track closely. I've broken this lecture into 4 parts: political experimentation in Europe, enclosure and masterless men, primogeniture and younger sons, and land equals independence. We will start off in this lecture taking a broad view of the European political landscape in the early modern period. You have heard me say before, especially if you have been coming to live lecture times, that Europe was in the process of consolidating into nation states. I will make a nod to the information that there are shades of meaning between nation state and nation state. There are also political history classes that will focus on those shades of meaning. If you have studied history in K-12 in the US, you may have heard something along the lines of, prior to the age of revolutions, generally centered on the American and maybe the French revolutions, Europe was ruled by monarchies. And that is true, sort of. In 1600, there were familiar kingdoms: Spain, which you learned about, France, Sweden, Kingdom of Sweden up there. There were principalities such as Wallachia, Moldavia, and Transylvania is squeezed in there. Yeah, right there. Nestled in here between the Commonwealth of Poland and Lithuania and the Ottoman Empire to the south, which means that there were also commonwealths and empires. Principalities were governed by a prince, but this sort of prince was not necessarily the son of a king, as we often think of it now. Principalities were sovereign states, and prince was usually an hereditary title on its own and did not guarantee eventual kingship. Even each of these, the Tsardom of Muscovy over here, the Ottoman Empire, and the Austrian monarchy, as well as some duchies, viceroyalties, and so on, had, in practice at least, a more complicated transfer of power than from dead father automatically to eldest son. The Commonwealth of Poland and Lithuania over the 17th to 18th centuries went from being an hereditary monarchy to having an elective monarch. To many American ears, elective monarchy sounds a bit of an oxymoron, a contradiction in terms, but you are seeing here many different approaches to the idea of country and government, ideas that were themselves shaped by different histories and philosophies of leadership dating back millennia, as well as different realities of geography and location. The early modern explorers sailing around the globe did generally represent nations with monarchs, but monarchy did not equal stability for nations squabbling over succession in Europe and colonized space everywhere else. I'm going to go through the next bit fairly quickly, as I want you to get the gist of things and not the specifics. Portugal had a relatively high turnover in monarchs during the 17th century. Philip I, Philip II, and Philip III, the prudent, the pious, and the tyrant, respectively, all from the House of Habsburg, followed by John IV, Alfonso VI, Peter II, and John V, those from the House of Braganza. We've seen the consolidation of Spain under Isabella I and Ferdinand V and II. They were of the House of Trastamara, but by the 17th century, Spain was ruled by the House of Habsburg, with Charles I, Philip II, Philip III, Philip IV, and Charles II following at a brisk pace before the House of Bourbon took over the leadership of Spain in 1700. France was a bit more stable, if being held under an absolute monarch claiming the divine right of kings is stability. Henri IV and Louis XIII were followed by Louis XIV, also known as the Sun King, of Versailles fame, as well as being famous for the abolition of the rights and the persecution of French Protestants. In England, Elizabeth Tudor backed some of the first English explorers to the eastern seaboard of North America. Her successor was James VI of Scotland, uniting England and Scotland into Great Britain. James I was followed by Charles I, who had his head chopped off by Protestant parliamentarians in 1649 during the English Civil War. England then had Protestant Cromwell as Lord Protector before reverting to the monarchy in 1660 under Charles II, whose greatest ambition was to die with his head still attached to his body. He succeeded, but at an age 3 years younger than my current age. He was followed by 3 more monarchs before 1700. The point here is that European colonists and explorers knew perfectly well that the idea of a single, all-powerful, and stable hereditary ruler was not the only possibility, and mostly was not a possibility at all without fighting. I'm bringing this up because the United States Constitution and government after the American Revolution so often seem to have come out of nowhere but the minds of the founding fathers. In reality, it was inspired by the parliamentary model of England, which by the 18th century held control of over the purse or money of Great Britain, a position of more effective power than the king by that time. Context will help us to understand both the English in England frame of mind, as well as why English colonists to the Americas thought and behaved as they did. English history tends to be as celebratory as American history. So I want to set England in the context of a Europe in flux, in the process of change. We will be looking at religious changes later in this module. Religious and political struggles were not separate entities here. So dividing them is artificial, but it makes it a bit easier to split the history up and introduce it in pieces. We will be looking briefly at different forms of government ending up with England, but let's lay a bit of common groundwork. As earlier in lecture, you absolutely do not need to worry about remembering any details of European government. My big point here is that the tidy monarchies culminating in George III of England have far more to do with wishful thinking than reality. And the US government did not arise from nothing in extra special minds, but had been in a process of experimentation in Europe that ran in tandem with the early modern 1600s colonization of the Americas. In the hegemonic ideal, all of these European leaders were men, and that was taken for granted, except there were individuals like Elizabeth I of England. The success of female monarchs generally involved working within the patriarchal pattern of European governments. The power that these women managed to maintain did not represent the breaking of glass ceilings and changes in the underlying power of patriarchy, but rather great individual skill in each case in working with and within the structure of European patriarchy. With that said, on to government systems. You can just barely see here at the tip of the arrow the electorate of Saxony. We are going to head into that region first. You are looking at, in the center, give or take a bit, what is now Germany mostly. The electorate of Saxony here in what I'm calling lilac, E stands for electorate on this map, in case you can actually see the writing. In addition to the electorate of Saxony, there is the electorate of Brandenburg in orange, north of Saxony, and the electorate of Bavaria in green, south of Saxony. This group of regions together formed what was then the Holy Roman Empire. Don't be confused. Rome, the city, was still down south of here in Italy. I am not going to get into the ins and outs and ideals and shenanigans of messy on-the-ground history here, but just point out that the electorates from the 13th century, the 1200s on, were intended to elect their central leader, the Holy Roman Emperor. If the name and idea of electors sounds familiar, it is because something of the basic idea ended up morphed during the Enlightenment as part of the American system of choosing an American president. Now, over to France. France, in the late 17th, early 18th century, was an hereditary monarchy. It was also a king's only monarchy. The role of all queens was to have male children to secure the French royal line. So don't necessarily read this onto other monarchies. That was definitely the case in France. French queens did not rule. The word Parliament, that you may know from the current government of England or Great Britain, is derived from the French parlement here, but they were not the same thing. In France, these were not legislative bodies, meaning making laws, but judicial organizations. In theory, these worked a little like the US Supreme Court. The judges of the Parlement could decide whether laws and edicts issued by the Crown would be officially accepted in their jurisdiction. And these judges also had power over taxation in their jurisdiction. The members of Parlement, the judges, were all aristocrats and were supposedly independent of the French king, supposedly. And that brings us to Louis XIV, also known as the Sun King of Versailles fame, both the actual place and various fictional accounts set in the palace. There was a TV show called Versailles when I first wrote this lecture. Supposedly, Louis XIV got annoyed in Parlement discussions over what constituted the governing structure of the nation state of France. In the story, Louis said, "L'État, c'est moi. The state is me. And by implication, I am the state." While the story is almost certainly apocryphal, meaning made up later and not true, the idea that the French monarch of the time held ultimate control of anything and everything that had to do with France is about right for this period. Popping over the channel from France to England, England did have a queen in the 16th century and 3 years into the 17th, Elizabeth I. And it was England under her, not Great Britain, until after Elizabeth I's death in 1603. Scotland was a separate country with its own monarchy. In 1558, Elizabeth I, the younger daughter of Henry VIII, famed through Europe then and now for his penchant for lopping off heads when he was irritated, including decapitating two of his wives. At any rate, both of Henry VIII's daughters became queens of England, but we are only interested in Elizabeth here. Despite having a queen, and a powerful one at that, England remained a kingdom, and Elizabeth sometimes referred to herself as her people's prince. Often to 20th and 21st century eyes, Elizabeth I's presentation appears a bit ridiculous. It certainly was exaggerated, and it was meant to be. Elizabeth was savvy. She managed to hold power despite being female by casting herself as an exception rather than a change to the rules. Elizabeth managed to hold the throne of England for 45 years until her death in 1603, a respectably long reign for any monarch of her era. Elizabeth I kept power until the moment of her death, just short of 70 years old, in part by never marrying. Had she married, she and England would have had to deal with the calculus of how political power might be shared or co-opted, given the reality that men held power in just about all European governments. Elizabeth became known as the Virgin Queen. Elizabeth also backed early English explorations of eastern North America. You can see her hand resting on the globe here. Eventually, the colony of Virginia would be named in honor of the Virgin Queen, which means that two current states of the United States, Virginia and West Virginia, proudly reflect in their names whether a woman who lived in the 16th century had sexual intercourse with a man or not. Elizabeth, as England's prince and virgin queen, did not have children. Without going into details, she was succeeded by James VI of Scotland, and he became James I of England. I'll note here that James I had a particular fixation with witches. We'll come back to that. In 1597, he had published a book that he had written on witchcraft called Demonology. Elizabeth I had issued some pardons to people convicted of witchcraft on a fairly regular basis, although this only represented a bit of a reduction in executions. The rate of witch executions in Elizabethan England was lower than in the rest of Europe. James I, on the other hand, participated personally in the trials of witches, including questioning under torture. He apparently became more skeptical as he grew older, which is small comfort to the original witches he took a personal interest in. James I and his successors also continued the exploration and colonization of North America. If you have heard of the Jamestown colony, that was named in his honor. The Carolinas, North and South Carolina, were named for a successor of James I, King Charles. Charles becomes Caro. The succession and fortunes of English monarchs will matter to us again when we discuss religion and North American colonization. But for now, just know that England had a monarchy, but it was not exactly like the French monarchy. Women could and did sometimes become queens or female kings, if you like. It did take considerable political skill for them to become and remain female kings in their own right, but a few, most notably Elizabeth I, managed it. The English monarchy also differed from the French in the relative power of the monarch and independence of the aristocracy. In England, there was a legislative body outside of the monarchy. Legislative means making laws. This was different to the judicial and pretty much powerless Parlement of France. The English Parliament is generally considered to date back to 1215, when King John was forced to sign the Magna Carta, a power-sharing agreement with his barons. This picture here is clearly not from 1215, but I love the resentful look on King John's face with the menacing barons and spiritual leaders leaning over him. The Magna Carta is often described as a royal charter of rights agreed by King John and his people, which it was, as long as we only consider people to be wealthy landowners, with wealth largely measured in terms of the amount of land and control over the kind of sort of people, the peasants, who lived and worked on that land. If you have never seen the film Monty Python and the Holy Grail, I am not sure whether I should recommend it or not. There are parts that I cannot watch because they reflect what was forward-thinking and edgy in the 1970s, but is appalling and cringe-inducing now, particularly when it comes to gender. On the other hand, during the 1980s and into the 90s, it was a cult film, and some parts of the movie are still terribly funny, at least to those of us who were around for the Thatcher years, which would be the Reagan years in the US. The film came out at a time when Great Britain was experiencing serious class conflict and labor protests. The Monty Python group was poking fun at the idea that England was built on any sort of ideas of equality. Still, it wasn't quite France. And here you have the peasants, and this is actually King Arthur, and that's his valet behind him. And the peasant is saying, "Help, help, I'm being repressed." Still, this was not quite France, and the land-owning nobility took themselves quite seriously. By 1542, Parliament included not just high-ranking nobles, duke, earl, and marquis, and yes, it is marquis here and not marquis, which suggests a type of tent in certain contexts. Back to English government. By 1542, Parliament also included so-called local representatives. Parliament split into two houses, the House of Lords and the House of Commons. Let's look more closely at what local representatives and commons or commoners mean in this usage. Sounds like everybody gets a say in government, right? Not so much. Universal manhood suffrage, and man does mean identified as male here, universal manhood suffrage would not exist in Great Britain until the fourth and final Reform Act, the Reform Act of, wait for it, 1918. So before 1918, who got to be a local representative and who got to elect the local representative? The salient factor was land ownership. This is a poster from 1839, so not where we are now in time, but pretty much close to the end of the time period covered by this course. And this poster is demanding universal suffrage without property qualifications. The list of demands sought by the organizers of the meeting was written by the London Working Men's Association. I know that it is probably difficult to see, but the poster uses the language of the people to deliberately include working class men as full people who should have a say in government. This was 1839, still within the period of this class, but barely. I focused in on the bottom of the poster, where you see those pink or however you identify that color ovals. These are uses of the word people to mean including people who are not property owners. You'll see that this was printed by the Carlisle Radical Association. There it is, down there. The idea that the working class should be included in the people was still radical in England in 1839. I also want to draw your attention to the bit circled in orange. If you cannot see it, the text there reads, "The progress of liberty." Here, liberty is equated with the right to vote, to have some say in government, and to count as a full citizen. Even in 1839, official liberty in England still depended on land ownership. But we haven't gotten to the 19th century yet. We are still back in the early modern period, and the linkage between land and independence was taken for granted by the English, including the ones who would colonize and explore North America. Land equaled independence for those Englishmen. Now I'll head back to England in the early modern period and see why so many Englishmen were willing to roll the dice with fairly even odds of living or dying to try living in the colonial outposts of early modern North America. If the laborers of England going into the early modern period were not people, how did they fit into English society? Remember that I am generalizing and simplifying in all of these lectures. Prior to the late 16th century, the 1500s, land in England was owned by the aristocracy and farmed by the peasant class. No say in government for the peasants, but in theory, their lord was supposed to look after them. This was somewhat more likely when the production of the lord's estate depended on having the labor not be dead. Before the late 16th century, some areas of land on an estate were designated as commons, meaning that everyone could make common use of that land to help with their survival. You'll see here that the land is divided into long strips or fields, each of which would have been planted in a different crop, and the Lord would have planned what was planted where. There would also be a commons somewhere on here that everybody could make use of. And then you can see there's a village and there are fields associated with the individual households that the families could use for their own production. Beginning in the late 16th century and continuing in fits and starts through the 18th century, changes in agriculture and farming meant that landowners could produce more with fewer laborers. Landlords, still largely the aristocracy, but beginning to include wealthy farmers and merchants, these landowners evicted small farmers and began to fence in large tracts of land, including commons, as their personal property. This is called enclosure because farming came to be associated with privately owned, fenced-in, or enclosed fields. In the right-hand image here, you can see that Crosswell Field has been claimed. So it's no longer this thing outside, it's been completely hemmed in, enclosed. Norton Hedgefield, same thing. It was off the edges here, and now it's just fully enclosed. And Great Heath, also fully enclosed. The village that used to do the farming and support the land is gone. It's just gone. As a result of enclosure, many people who had done the farming were forced off of agricultural land. They flooded into cities, especially London. Laborers could no longer grow their own food and had to figure out other ways to survive. But economies and industrial production, such as it was, were not able to incorporate this so-called surplus of people. Yeah, that is the word people, but they weren't really people, like women, not really people. People, real ones, in power dealt with this by labeling the poor rogues, vagabonds, vagrants, and thieves, which they often were, though generally not by choice. Such people as a group were considered to be masterless men. meaning they weren't apprenticed to anyone, they didn't work for anyone. Penalties for the crimes of poverty, including everything from being unemployed to stealing to counterfeiting money, ranged from whipping to hanging. Women suffered the same poverty and the same penalties, despite the whole not being a masterless man thing. English colonies in North America and Australia, although that does not concern us here, offered another way for England to offload disruptive poor people. Rather than choosing between starvation and capital crimes in London, these individuals could become colonists. Theoretically, if transported convicts were men, they had a chance, if they survived, of becoming productive citizens, contributing to the glory and wealth of England. The contributing to England's wealth and glory, that was the elite plan. The not dying was the plan of the poor. Those individuals transported had a chance, at that point a slim one, but a chance of obtaining liberty, but not the way we tend to think of liberty now. For British men, liberty meant economic independence. And economic independence in England meant owning land. Working for wages for money was considered a form of dependence. Your wages and your survival depended on the person you were working for. Farming land as part of an estate was a bit different. You controlled your production, raised your own food, and your family was part of the land for generations. Being an artisan was also somewhat different. You were paid specifically for the products of your trained skill, but doing drudge labor for wages was entirely a form of dependence. This is part of what lent to the glamour of highwaymen. They might be hanged young, but at least they would die independent and not as a pathetic wage worker with no say over their own body while it lived. That explains why the poor and desperate would take a chance on North America. But why would men of aristocratic birth? And there were those that went to North America as well. This brings us to primogeniture and the problem of younger sons. If, like me, you have been bombarded for the past couple of years with coverage of Prince Harry of England and his memoir titled Spare, then the idea of an heir and a spare among the English aristocracy won't seem completely odd, as it usually does to students. If you have managed to escape the entire Prince Harry saga, then fear not. You will soon know about the heir and spare strategy anyway. Don't worry about the details on the inheritance chart on the slide here. I am using the succession logic that put James the First and Sixth on the throne of England after Elizabeth I to illustrate the larger point about primogeniture and land in England. Lineages like this were used to determine who should inherit a particular title and who should inherit a landed estate. Both law and custom in England followed the idea of primogeniture. Primo is first, gen you might recognize from gender. Primogeniture was the firstborn. Primogeniture meant that the eldest surviving son inherited everything. Land, titles, fortune, name, the crown of England in this case. This makes sense if you think about the equation between land and status, which became exacerbated by enclosure and the enlargement of estates. A family's status determined their power, and status was directly related to how much land they had. The ideal was to keep family estates as large as possible rather than dividing those estates up among children as inheritance. Daughters rarely inherited land, which is why it was such a big deal for the landed gentry to marry their daughters into other good landed families so that they did not end up impoverished in later life. Sons provided a different sort of problem. Life was tenuous at best, and a single son might very well die before having a son of his own. That meant keeping estates and patrilineal family titles together was tricky. So most landed families, titled or not, tried to have at least two boys. The first was the heir, the second was the spare. The trouble was that if the older boy lived and inherited, that left the younger brother or brothers without land. Accepting wage labor or really any work outside of the church or the higher echelons of the military was absolutely out of the question. On the slide here, this is Blickling Hall, which is now managed by the National Trust. The estate associated with it now has been whittled down to somewhere around 4,000 to 5,000 acres, which tells you how big it was to begin with. Kind of keep this image in your mind. You will see similar things crop up in America. Land meant establishing their fortune for younger sons and maybe starting their own landed estate to keep money coming in. Sugar plantations in the Caribbean were incredibly lucrative for people who possessed them, people who generally lived in England and might never visit the estate that funded their aristocratic lifestyle. All of these factors, enclosure, primogeniture, the equation of land with power, and the concentration of land in fewer and fewer hands, meant that colonizing the so-called New World appealed to many different types of English people, from the most impoverished to aristocratic but impecunious, meaning without money, younger sons. John Smith, whose name you may or may not recognize from some version of the Pocahontas story, the real, not the fictional John Smith, wrote after arriving in America in 1607, "In America, every man may be the master and owner of his own labor and land." Few things to note here. The gendered language matters. Men could be independent, but except in rare circumstances, English women spent their entire lives as legal dependents, first on their father and then on their husband. Next, although there were certainly Englishmen with get-rich-quick schemes who dreamed of finding gold or silver as the Spanish had done, this was not the big draw for English colonists, particularly by the 17th century, when they figured out there wasn't much of that in North America. More than anything else, Englishmen were attracted by the promise of independence that followed from owning land. Economic freedom and the possibility of giving that land and thus independence to one's children, or at least one's sons, was the biggest attraction that led people to leave England for uncertain survival in North America in the 17th century. Key points for Lecture 9. European countries in the early modern period were not all just monarchies. Systems of government could be, and usually were, much more complicated. England had an hereditary monarch. England also had a legislative body, Parliament, made up of two groups: the male nobility, House of Lords, and the representatives of the people, in quotes, the House of Commons. The people who could elect local members of Parliament had to own land. Beginning in the 16th century, large landowners began to enclose their lands. They removed villages from their estates as they no longer needed farm labor, and they took over commons, land that had been held in common and available to the lower class. The displaced poor sought a way to sustain themselves when there really was nothing for them. Many of these masterless men ended up in London. Poverty, in the form of unemployment and vagrancy, was punishable by law. Primogeniture meant that titles and large landed estates passed in toto or completely to the eldest surviving son. This left younger sons, raised as wealthy aristocrats, dependent on others for their livelihood. The colonization of North America was not intended by the government of England to help with the problems of masterless men and younger sons, but intended or not, moving to North America offered both of these groups hopes of independence as they conceptualized it then that could never be realized in England. Stay tuned for a quick look at men's fashion in the Tudor era. Tudor was the last name of Henry VIII and Elizabeth I. James I, his last name was Stuart. I've got three individuals that you will be looking at here and want to remind you of the wear the pants expression before we dive into the coda. This is Henry VIII on the left and on the right there, father of Elizabeth I. This bit here in his clothing was and is called the cod piece. Henry VIII was not the only noble of his time to wear a cod piece. They were quite popular, enough so that they were included on armor. This fashion had more to do with symbolism and communication based on the construction of sex gender than it did with protection or convenience. Sir Walter Raleigh, a favorite of Elizabeth I, pictured here on both the left and the right, and an explorer involved in the English colonization of North America, you could see that in Elizabeth I's time, and particularly in her court, the cod piece fell completely out of favor and disappeared. The front of the doublet has taken on a very particular shape. You can see it a little bit better here. It's called a peascod. I've heard the shape compared to a pea pod, a pouter pigeon, or a goose. The doublet had to be stuffed to maintain this shape. The peascod doublet was popular in other parts of Europe, not just in Elizabeth's court. It made the wearer look both proud and affluent enough to have a belly, a protruding belly. This last of the three individuals, first Henry VIII, then Sir Walter Raleigh, and now Richard Sackville, 3rd Earl of Dorset. Sackville also attended the court of Elizabeth I and then that of her successor, James I. Sackville had absolutely exquisite taste in clothing. These are actually two different outfits. If you look close enough, you can see that. This is a close-up of a shoe and stocking on this right, and they are absolutely magnificent. Remember, the stocking had to be knitted by hand, it had to be embroidered by hand, the shoes had to be cut and made by hand, the lace had to be made by hand, the gold thread for the embroidery, yeah, you get it. The shoes on the left are more difficult to see on the background carpet, but they also are quite wonderful. Sackville managed to run through both his own and his wife's considerable fortunes, but he looked good doing it, and he funded a number of skilled artisans. This is for my people who do know Monty Python and the Holy Grail. It's just a harmless little bunny, isn't it? Run away, run away. If you haven't seen it, you could find just that last part on YouTube.